Chapter 19. Nobody wins the dragon race. Not for the first time, Jack felt as if investigating only led to more questions and no answers. He'd woken up, back on the island, and this time with half his face buried in the dirt instead of snow. In his hand he found a new crystal, the crystal from the 1920s. It had followed them back to the past, just like last time. Except it wasn't just like last time. They'd visited the 1920s instead of the workshop, and they'd found the crystal in some stranger's gift to his British wife. It didn't make any sense, and Jack had really been looking forward to seeing the other Guardians again. He depended on it. On top of that, he'd woken up to the twins freaking out. They'd thought all three of them were dead, cursed by the ancient occult circle or something. Jack managed to reassure them that this had happened the last time as well, and though they seemed to accept it eventually, things weren't the same afterwards. Ruffin and Toughnut both acted tough, and yeah, they were tough. But this was new ground for them. All they knew about magic was through the folklore of their village, and most of it was dark, horrible stuff. It wasn't a surprise that they seemed wary around Jack and Jamie, and Babytooth, which was hilarious, because Jack could not for the life of him figure out what was so terrifying about a fairy the size of their index fingers, after they'd awoken from the dead. That didn't stop Jack from being peeved when Ruffin seemed reluctant to have him close to her when they'd mounted Barf again. One would have thought that Jack would be glad to have Ruffin stop flirting with him, if you could call it flirting, but not on the basis that Jack frightened her. Ruffin and Toughnut being scared didn't seem like something that was possible. Jack hated being the exception. Before they'd left the island, Jack had tried activating the new crystal with the help of the circle again, but nothing happened. It seemed it only worked once with each type of magic, as if the crystal was absorbing it and creating a resistance to it. Almost like the time fragment taking away Jack's powers. He didn't like that comparison. It made him wonder if they were making a mistake by using the crystals. Using them for what, he no longer knew. All he knew was that he now had a new piece of the crystal, and that he needed to find another source of magic to activate it. They returned to Berg before dinner was over, and thankfully nobody seemed to have noticed their absence. The twins left them in front of the great hall, as if they needed to get away and regroup. Jack could only imagine the theories they were cooking up. Anything goes, he caught himself thinking. At this point, I'm no wiser than they are. He fell asleep next to the hearth, wondering how he'd lost himself while he was alone in that jazz club, and how everything had come back to him when he'd laid eyes on Jamie. It had felt like when you're on the brink of falling asleep, when nonsensical thoughts start seeming sensible. Seeing Jamie had been like jolting awake. If Jamie and Babytooth hadn't come, would he have remained there? The thought was terrifying. He wished he hadn't given the bed back to Hiccup. Things always felt a little less overwhelming when he was around. But the truth was that no matter how much Hiccup told him that they were fine, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of tension between them. Hiccup deserved to know more than Jack let him, but he knew that was impossible. Especially now that Jack had seen how badly Ruffin and Toughnut reacted to magic. The twins were even devoted to the god Loki, and Jack didn't need to be an expert in Norse mythology to know that that guy wasn't entirely good. If Ruffin and Toughnut couldn't handle it, Jack didn't want to imagine what Hiccup would feel. He'd never look at Jack the same way again. And then there was the whole thing with being careful while they were stuck in the past, in case their actions could change things. Telling the twins had already been a risky, possibly even a bad, move. But if Jack was to be honest with himself, he knew the practical reasons didn't scare him nearly as much as the thought of being feared by Hiccup. This awkward tension wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternative. Preparations for the dragon race continued at full speed the next few days. A colorful structure had been slowly rising near the harbor, and it wasn't until a couple of days before the race would take place that Jack realized that they were building bleachers. And while being awfully busy with that, and with various other son of the chief duties, Hiccup had taken it upon himself to teach both Jack and Jamie how to write. Jamie was ecstatic, Jack not so much. "You wouldn't have survived math class," Jamie whispered to him one evening, 6 days after their trip to the 20s. "School always seemed like a nice comfort to torture kids to me," Jack mumbled back. "You seem to be doing good, though." Jamie looked down at his sheet, where Hiccup had doodled a bunch of figures, mostly terrifying Berg-like things such as dragons, swords, big legs, Stoick the Vast, for Jamie to write down the words. "It's fun," he said with a bright smile. Jack squinted. "If you say so." Hiccup came in with a bowl of something in his hands. For a dreadful moment, Jack thought it was leftovers from today's dinner, but then Hiccup sat down by the hearth with them and offered them a huge pile of wild berries. "Dessert," he said with a self-satisfied smile. "How's it going?" Jamie grabbed a handful of berries in exchange for his worksheet. Hiccup made an impressed face. "You're a really fast learner, Jamie," he said, making Jamie smile modestly. Then Hiccup turned to Jack and raised a brow as if he already knew his results would be less than stellar. "Jack?" Jack dramatically dropped his head into his arms. "I don't need this," he said. "I've been fine until now." "I'll admit Birchins aren't the most literate of people, but I'll still say it's a nice skill to have," Hiccup argued. "Is it really that different from the characters you use?" Jack shrugged. "There are some similarities," Jamie said. "So why don't you write down those characters, Jack?" Hiccup said. "Explain the sounds, and then you can learn those who are similar first." He seemed like he thought that was a brilliant idea, but Jack found himself awkwardly twirling a lock of hair. "Jamie can do it," he said. Hiccup frowned. Yeah, but Jamie's busy. Why can't you do it?" "Because—" Jack let his hand fall in his lap. He glanced at Jamie, who had looked up from his worksheet with a puzzled expression. "Thing is, I can't read." Jamie's mouth fell open, realization dawning on his face. "Oh my God," he said, slipping into English. "Because you're from, like, the 1700s, and most people didn't even—" He stopped himself by bringing a hand to his mouth, because that definitely didn't look suspicious. Hiccup looked understandably confused. "But Jamie can? What was that?" "Yeah, I never got the opportunity to learn like Jamie did," Jack said, suppressing an amused smile at Jamie's saucer eyes. "And then there never really was a moment where I actually needed to read, so I never bothered to learn it myself. It's just too much work. No fun at all." "Is that the truth?" Jack blinked. Hiccup's expression was open, if only a tiny bit skeptic. It made Jack's heart sink. "Yeah," he replied softly. He hesitated. "Just not the whole truth." Jamie's mouth had become a thin, anxious line. He kept silent, but his eyes flickered between the two of them. He hadn't commented on Jack's confession to Hiccup, contrary to his open skepticism towards revealing the truth to Roughnut and Toughnut. Hiccup held Jack's gaze for a moment before nodding. "Okay." He looked down at Jamie's worksheet. "Well, if you really don't want to learn, then I'm not going to force you, Jack." Jack didn't know what to say. There was absolutely no bite in Hiccup's voice, so whatever metaphorical bite marks Jack felt sink into his flesh had to be entirely forged by his own mind. Unless they weren't, and Hiccup was actually mad. Or wary, or scared. Hiccup?" Jamie said after a moment, his voice small. He held up another piece of parchment where he'd scribbled on some runes. No, not runes. Jack's eyes widened when he recognized the symbols. "Do you know what these are?" Hiccup tilted his head to the side. He took the parchment and peered at the symbols. "I don't think so," he said, frowning. "Though they look vaguely familiar, almost like Gothi symbols." Jack recalled something Jamie had said on the island. "Ancient even for Vikings." "Gothi is ancient," Jack said. "Wow, Jack," Hiccup was fighting a smile. "We all know there's no need to be rude. I'll be right back." Jack grabbed the parchment and was out the door before either of them could protest. It wasn't until he'd reached the base of the hill to Gothi's hut that he realized he'd actually have to climb it. He hadn't done that since they moved down to Astrid's. With a dramatic sigh, he started the trek. Halfway up, Babytooth appeared out of nowhere, announcing her presence with a cheerful chirp that nearly sent Jack tumbling back down. Jack muttered a curse that he definitely adopted from Gobber. He sincerely hoped Thor wasn't listening. "You're gonna give me a heart attack," he laughed. "Can people get heart attacks that easily?" Babytooth shrugged, zipping around him curiously. When she asked him what he was doing, Jack said that he wasn't entirely sure, and that wasn't entirely a lie either. A few minutes later, they stood in front of Gothi's door. Jack rapped his knuckles against it. The first thing he heard was the grunt of a grunkle. Then came the uneven footsteps of Gothi, and the door swung open. Gothi peered up at him with a grumpy expression. Then again, she almost always peered up at people like that. "Hope I'm not intruding," Jack said with an easygoing smile. "I have some questions that I thought you might be able to answer, being the village elder and all." He shifted. "Also, can I come in? It's freezing." Gothi raised her eyebrows, but let him in. Her grunkle eyed him and Babytooth tiredly as they walked over to the hearth before deciding they weren't worthy of his attention. Babytooth gave a chirp that Jack translated to, "How are you supposed to get any answers from Gothi when you can't understand her?" Jack sent her a look which translated to, "You know I can't answer you right now." Which was a good thing, because Jack didn't know the answer. But it was worth a try. Gothi joined them by the hearth, her eyes flickering down to the parchment in Jack's hand. He showed it to her. "Do you know these symbols?" he asked. He expected her to shake her head, like Hiccup and the twins had done. Instead, her brows furrowed deeply only a moment before they shot up to her hairline. She sent Jack a scandalized look, taking the parchment from him. Jack shared a glance with Babytooth while Gothi was distracted, but then Gothi placed a bony hand on his arm. She wore a grim expression and shook her head. She wasn't saying that she didn't know the symbols, she was giving him a warning. "But what are they?" he asked. "They can't be evil. I heard." He dared sending Babytooth another look. "That they weren't evil?" Babytooth chirped helplessly. It hadn't seemed malevolent to her. Without warning, Gothi grabbed his cloak and tucked him down so that they were on eye level. She shook her head again, somehow even more gravely than before. Then her eyes narrowed. She raised her hand and pressed her fingers lightly against Jack's heart. Jack suddenly wished he hadn't come up here. He didn't need words to understand what was going through Gothi's head. I truly don't know anything about the symbols," he said, gently moving Gothi's hand away. She let it fall, but her suspicious gaze didn't waver. Jack swallowed. "But you know something, don't you? You know they're magic." He didn't dare say the word. Gothi raised her chin but said nothing. Of course she said nothing, but her gaze was knowing. Jack had spent enough time with Sandy to be able to understand a message even without words. And right now, he interpreted that she knew about magic, she knew that Jack knew, and she wanted an explanation. "You can't tell anyone," Jack said before he could think twice. At least Babytooth remained quiet, so maybe he wasn't making a terrible mistake. He struggled with finding the right words, wondering where he should start, but then he had a realization. "Do you know what this is?" He pointed to the marks on his face. Gothi's expression seemed to darken. She nodded for him to go on. "The Snow Queen," Jack said. She's... I think she's coming here, for me, to get rid of me." When Gothi's expression didn't waver, Jack warily went on. "She considers me a threat, I think, because I used to be..." He didn't want to say like her, though their powers seemed to be pretty much the same. Gothi nodded slowly. She glanced down at the parchment and then up at Jack again. Then she threw the parchment into the fire. Her expression softened, and once again she placed a hand on Jack's chest. She trusted him. She was asking him to be careful. At least that's what Jack hoped she was saying, and not, "Sorry, you are doomed." "It was an evil place," Jack snapped 2 days later. Being out in the village and in the company of Hiccup, it took Babytooth a moment before she realized Jack was talking to her. She tilted her tiny head to the side in confusion, then seemed to understand what he was talking about. She chirped an apology, and Jack held back a sigh. It wasn't that he was angry with Babytooth. He knew none of them truly knew what they were doing, and they hadn't talked about the conversation with Gothi ever since leaving her hut that night, simply because Jack didn't know what to do with the information. And he didn't want to scare Jamie. By activating and using the crystal with malevolent magic, what did that mean for them? And talking about the possibility of the Snow Queen coming to kill him, it brought it all back to reality. It was easier to shove it into the back of his head and pretend it was just a bad dream. But the Snow Queen wasn't pitch. Telling himself he wasn't afraid would do no good. "It's like when I didn't notice what she was either," Jack muttered quietly, but loud enough for Babytooth to hear. "I didn't sense that there was anything vicious about her. Did you? Apart from the fact that you caught her trying to murder me." Babytooth thought about it for a moment before she shook her head. "When I was a spirit, I would notice things like that," Jack said. He glanced at Hiccup and Jamie, still a few meters ahead of him. They were walking towards the Great Hall, but Jack was pretty sure that wasn't the destination they were heading. He lowered his voice. "And you notice stuff like that too, right? It's like, even when Bunny and I were at each other's throats, I could feel that his magic was good. And even when Pitch tried to get me on his side, even when I started to pity him..." He grimaced, and Babytooth winced. I still felt that his magic was dark. He looked around, a sudden feeling of unease overcoming him. He knew he was just freaking himself out by pondering about this, and the foggy weather wasn't helping. It had been bad enough this morning, but it only seemed to be getting worse. The village looked dead and deserted. The only proof of life, except for the four of them, was the distant chatter from the stands. "Do you think," Jack started nervously, "that you can't sense it because it's an entirely new world of magic you're facing?" Babytooth hummed softly. Maybe. She couldn't be sure. Neither of them could. "If that is the case, we still don't have any other choice, right?" Jack bit his lip, keeping his eyes on the faint outline of the huts. The fog made it look like figures were sneaking along the walls. He shuddered. "We need to find other sources of magic. And if they're evil, well..." "Jack?" Hiccup was looking at him curiously. "Something wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack shook his head, forcing a smile on his face. "Nothing, just the weather. It's spooky, isn't it?" "A little too spooky," Hiccup agreed, but more like he was disappointed than anything. They'd gotten to the top of the stairs to the great hall, and he gestured to the right, over the banister. "I swear this is the best view, but only when you can actually see." "This wouldn't be a problem if we could just sit on the bleachers like everyone else," Jamie muttered. Hiccup said, which about summed up Jack's entire mood these days. "Dad's only doing this for appearance's sake. I'm sure he trusts you." He didn't sound all too sure. "Besides, maybe he knew I'd show you this place anyway. That way, you get to see the race, and Dad gets to dodge questions from the less trusting people in the village." "It's not like we've been here for 1,000 years already and nothing has happened," Jack said, rolling his eyes. "A bit of an overstatement, maybe?" 950 then. "And you did crash our training drill," Hiccup reminded him. "But that didn't hurt anyone," Jack protested. Jamie sent him a pointed look. "Except me, but that doesn't count." Hiccup sighed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'd have thought people were all right with you by this point. At least most people are. Up here." He climbed up a small ledge, leading them onto a narrow path on the side of the mountain. Jack got up first, then held out a hand to Jamie. "Think how much easier this would have been if this thing worked," Jack said, sending his staff a disapproving look. Not that it was his staff's fault. It was Jack who wasn't working. "A little exercise won't hurt you, Jack," Jamie replied with a cheeky smile. "Who taught you to be so snarky?" Hiccup snorted. "I wonder." "You're not in any place to call me snarky, Hiccup." "Yes, you're both very good role models for me," Jamie promised. Jack cackled, and Hiccup had the grace to look a little embarrassed. It took a bit of climbing, and an awkward instance of Hiccup slipping on his prosthetic and crashing into Jack's arms. It would have been sweet if Hiccup's forehead hadn't collided painfully with Jack's nose. But they eventually ended up on a grassy ledge with lots of ground to sprawl out on and little chance of accidentally tumbling off. It was high above ground, perfect for secret picnics, people watching, and stargazing. At least it would have been on any other day. "It's a beautiful shade of grey, I must say," Jack said, admiring the fog. Hiccup shifted awkwardly. "Maybe it'll let up before the race starts." Jack made a non-committal noise. The fog was thick, thicker than any fog Jack had seen in quite a while, and felt awfully sinister. Even Hiccup seemed wary as he tried peering through it. Jack wondered if he was the type to get spooked by ghost stories. "Can you even fly like this?" Jamie asked. "Oh, don't worry. This fog actually gives Toothless and I an advantage. None of the other dragons can fly blind like Toothless," Hiccup said. He seemed so pleased with himself, Jack couldn't help but grin. After Hiccup left them, Jack and Jamie tried sitting down on the grass. It was wet and cold, and Jack said they could use his cloak as a blanket. It took about 10 minutes, and Jamie frustratingly insisting that Jack was freezing and that he wasn't good at hiding it, before they stood again. Babytooth was the only comfortable one, getting to snuggle up in the crook of Jack's neck. "At least we'll see them when they fly through the village," Jamie said. Then he sighed. "I wish I could ride a dragon." "You did ride a dragon," Jack said. "I know Barf and Belch look more like sock puppets, but they are a dragon." Jamie snorted. Then his smile faded. "I don't think they'll let us ride with them anymore," he said. Jack already knew what he was thinking about. He took a deep breath and let it out again in a puff of white mist. "Maybe not," he admitted. I'm sorry, Jamie. It's not your fault, Jamie said. It's just Roughnet and Toughnut being dumb. They don't even realize I'm just a normal, not magical human. To be fair, so am I right now, Jack said. But I guess I can't blame them for wanting to stay on the safe side. We know these Vikings are superstitious, and my collapsing after interacting with the circle of evil symbols isn't what I'd call a promising sign. We don't know if they were evil, Jamie said. Oh, right. Jamie's eyes narrowed. You have that look on your face. There's no look on my face. Jack? Okay, I talked to Gothi and he was interrupted by the roaring blow of a horn, startling all three of them. Jamie giggled, and Jack would have as well, if he hadn't been hit with a sudden wave of dizziness. He took a step back. He almost raised his hand to rub at the side of his head, but kept it down not to worry Jamie. What was that? Wow, amazing, Jamie said. Jack wondered what his mom would think of his fresh fluency in sarcasm once they got back. Who's in the lead? Jack laughed. Probably Hiccup, with his advantage. I think it's echolocation, Jamie said. Sometimes he said words that seemed made up to Jack, but he nodded. Whatever that is, I'm sure Hiccup will win. Did you see how self-satisfied that smirk was? Jamie sent him a strange smile, as if he knew something Jack didn't. Jack raised a brow. What? Nothing, Jamie replied. You're probably right. Jack was about to probe him for answers, but then there was a sudden gust of biting wind. It shouldn't have worried Jack the way it did. It was just the wind, after all. But it made him clench his fist around his staff. The fog seemed to be getting thicker. It looked almost tangible, shifting and swirling in the air. It gave Jack unpleasant flashbacks to Pitch's nightmare sand. Jamie nudged him. The smile had disappeared from his face, and instead he wore that worried frown he wore way too often these days. Is something wrong? No, Jack replied, and hoped he wasn't lying. It's just cold. You thinking about something? Jamie pressed. Jack smiled exasperatedly. Are my expressions really that easy to read? Like an open book, Jamie confirmed. Tell me. I'm not sure, Jack said. I guess I'm just jumpy. Something about the atmosphere, it feels off. Babytooth chirped softly, but it didn't do much to calm Jack's nerves. She says she doesn't feel anything. He translated for Jamie. So don't worry about it. There was a distant sound of snot-loud screaming, followed by some sort of bleating. What do they need the sheep for? Jamie said, looking slightly horror-struck. Jack wasn't paying attention. There was a tingling on the side of his face, a tingling which was gradually turning into something more intense. He raised his hand and brushed his fingers over his cheek. Why was his heart beating so fast? The fog shifted, revealing the village below and the faint shape of the bleachers. The ocean was still out of sight. It was unnerving. Something's coming. Jack must have gasped, because Jamie's head snapped to look at him. Then his eyes widened. Jack, the marks, he said, pointing at his face. They're brighter. It wasn't surprising. The skin where the mark stretched out was rapidly beginning to feel like it was on fire. Jack's body felt stiff with a sudden, all-encompassing fear. Not something, the voice in his head said. Someone. She's here. Jamie blinked. What? He said, but the quiver in his voice told Jack he already understood. It brought Jack out of his shaken state, and he crouched down in front of him. We have to get to the bleachers, he said, and warn them. What's going to happen? They won't be able to see her, will they? I don't... His voice got stuck in his throat as cold seeped into his body, and he placed a hand on the ground to support himself. Jamie tried to steady him as well, his face ashen. I don't know, Jack managed, shaking his head. Probably not. I don't know what she'll do, but I can feel it. Her anger. He looked at Babytooth. It's getting closer. Get toothless. Babytooth darted off without another sound. Another flash of cold, and it felt like ice splinters in his veins. Jack, Jamie said, but his voice sounded far away. Jack felt his eyes sliding shut, images fluttering on the back of his lids. A stormy night, trudging through the snow, a dark cave bathed in faint blue light. Jamie's grip on him tightened. Don't pass out! He held back a groan. I won't, he said, trying to sound reassuring, opening his eyes again. He let out a shaky breath, his teeth clattering. This wasn't the time to recall any new parts of his memory. Listen, when we get to the bleachers, find the other kids. You'll be taken somewhere safe. I have to... No, Jamie protested. You don't have to do anything. The Snow Queen is... She almost killed you last time. She's here because of me, Jack said, hating the helplessness in his voice. So you're just going to go to her? And then what? Jamie was shaking his head, his eyes brimming with tears. Maybe if she can't find you... He trailed off, realizing how hopeless that suggestion was. Jack didn't know what he could say to calm him down. He didn't know if there was anything to say that wasn't outright lies. And he didn't know how the Snow King could be at Berg already. She said she could go only where the winter goes. They were way into fall, but Jack knew winter, and this wasn't it. The sound of beating wings made them both turn. A vague shape in the fog was coming towards them. Jack? Hiccup's voice sounded strangely far away, as if the fog was muffling him. Hiccup, Jack replied, getting to his feet. Toothless broke through the fog, and he and Hiccup came into clear view. They landed on the ledge, and Baby Tooth came back to Jack's side. Hiccup wore an expression that wasn't unfamiliar to him these days, confused and exasperated. Did you call for Toothless? He suddenly refused to continue the race, he complained. What's going on? We were in the lead, I think. Something about this fog is blocking Toothless's. I think you're going to be attacked, Jack said, stepping towards him. You have to take us to Stoick, quickly. Hiccup blinked. You think we're going to be attacked? He repeated. He sounded so lost it seemed his voice didn't even have the capacity left to sound worried. What are you talking about? What? Jack! His mouth fell open. Your face, your wound. I know, Jack interrupted, placing an urgent hand on Hiccup's knee. Take us to the bleachers. You have to... He shuddered suddenly, his hand jolting to the fern patterns. The air around them seemed almost warm in comparison to the whiteout spreading from the pattern and through his body. Hiccup's hand landed heavily on his shoulder, steadying him. What's going on? The worry had belatedly arrived in his voice now, along with a steely sort of authority that Jack didn't often hear from him. Jack's mind was swimming. It felt as if he had a song stuck in his head, but instead of an annoying tune, it was a flat, malicious stream of fury. She's on the island, he choked out. She's not alone. He must have sounded like he was dying, because Hiccup quickly helped him climb onto Toothless in the very front. Jamie followed, climbing up at the back. Hold on tight, Jamie, Hiccup warned. I know, I've done this before, Hiccup sighed. Of course you have. They took to the sky, and Jack almost toppled right off. His head was spinning, and his joints felt like they were turning to stone. He faintly noticed Hiccup steadying him, but he was afraid he'd passed out if he stopped focusing on not passing out for just a single second. He thought he was beginning to lose it when he heard the bleating of a sheep, followed by Astrid's voice. Hiccup, what are you doing? She yelled, coming to fly beside them. Jack looked up. She was carrying a black sheep. Emergency, Hiccup said, though he didn't sound entirely sure. Jack was... Stop the race, Jack rasped. Astrid warned the others about an attack. I'll explain later. Just please hurry. Astrid's expression was bordering on fury, but that only meant she was taking him seriously. She glanced at Hiccup, then nodded and flew off. Are you really going to explain? Hiccup asked as they soared towards the bleachers. Jack's stomach twisted. I'll certainly have to try, he muttered darkly. The crowd roared as Toothless flew over the stands, but then came to a confused murmur as he took a sharp turn and landed on the platform where Stoick, Gobber, Spiteloud, and Gothi were standing. Spiteloud barked a laugh. Giving up already, Hiccup? He seemed to be the only one seeing the humor in the situation. Gobber looked mostly confused, but Gothi was quick to catch Jack's eye, alarm in her expression. She nodded, and then, without bringing any attention to herself, she climbed onto a gronkel and took off. If she could sense what Jack was sensing, she probably understood that this was no fight for an old lady, and had gone to take cover. Stoick's brow furrowed dangerously. What's this about? Jack didn't hobble off Toothless as much as he stumbled, and almost face-planted on the soggy floorboards. You have to get back to the village, he said. Because of the fog, the murmuring from the crowd seemed strangely far away, so he didn't even have to raise his voice for Stoick to hear him. He tried stopping his teeth from clattering as he spoke. Something's coming. An attack of some sort. He grimaced, wishing he'd left out that last part. What? He said there's... Gobber started. I heard him. Stoick looked from Jack to Hiccup. Jamie was no longer with them. Jack spotted him running through the crowd towards Brand and his other friends. Jackson, if you have anything you need to tell me... I am telling you, Jack interrupted. Of course, Stoick would immediately distrust him for coming up with something like this out of nowhere. It didn't make Jack feel any less frustrated at being suspected for something he didn't do. At least the anger gave him the energy to stand taller and look steadily up at Stoick. "Burke is in danger. You have to act fast. She's—" Something whizzed past Jack's ear and burrowed into Stoick's throne, right where the chief's head would have been had he been sitting on it. A stark white arrow. The crowd, who had been chattering uneasily, went deathly quiet. A freezing wind washed over the bleachers, and Jack staggered. "Jack!" Hiccup was at his side immediately, grabbing his arms to keep him upright. "Gobber, spite loud," Stoick said, and the two of them ran off the platform without another word. The following reaction was so immediate, Jack could almost think the entire village had been hoping for something like this to happen. The Burkians burst into action. People ran into each other, pushing and elbowing their way through the crowd. Those who had weapons grabbed them and held them high with ferocious battle cries. Some screamed at the unseen archer to come out of the fog and fight honorably. Spiteloud and Gobber did their best at making sure everyone got to the island safely and didn't topple off of the bleachers and into the sea. Jack couldn't see Jamie anywhere. He shrugged off Hiccup and started to walk away, but a giant hand grabbed his arm and tugged him back, less than gently. "You're not getting out of my sight," Stoick growled. "I have to find Jamie," Jack said, trying to tug his arm back, but to no avail. It was like trying to move a boulder. Stoick sent Hiccup a pointed look, as if this was his fault, then turned back to Jack. "How did you know about this attack? Where are they coming from?" "Let me go!" Jack yelled. "Dad, Jack wouldn't—" "Shut it, Hiccup! I knew this would happen. Now if you don't tell me—" Jack was starting to feel apoplectic. "Let me go, or I'll—" Or what? Stoick's expression was thunderous. In any other situation, he would have scared Jack. But as it was, Jack couldn't be any more panicked than he already was, and all he felt for Stoick was a fierce disdain towards authority figures. So when it became clear that there was no way he was willingly letting Jack go, Jack did the only thing he could think of. His staff connected with Stoick's nose. To a mountain of a man such as him, it shouldn't have made any difference, but miraculously, Stoick stumbled backwards with a surprised groan. Jack tucked his arm back and ran. "Jamie!" Brand looked just as confused as the rest of the crowd as Jamie joined them, and then even more so when he grabbed his arm urgently. Undis, Hildur, and Skadi stood beside him, all sharing the same alarmed face except for Skadi, who only looked pleasantly surprised. "We gotta go," Jamie said. "Something's going to happen." "Something?" Undis repeated, wrinkling her nose. "I thought you weren't allowed to ride dragons." "I'm not," Jamie confirmed, looking back at Jack, but he and the rest of the people on the chief's platform were hidden by the crowd. "But it was an emergency. It is an emergency. We have to get back to the village. It's not safe." The crowd suddenly gasped. The fog shifted ever so slightly, but all he could see was Jack and the others crouched in alarm, and not why they were doing that. Whatever it was, it made a wave of panic pass through the villagers, and in the next second, people were stampeding to get off the bleachers. Jamie and his friends were forced along with the crowd, no matter how much Jamie wanted to stay behind to make sure Jack was all right. Jamie held onto Brand's arm as they ran for the village, trying his best not to get stepped on. It was impossible to keep track of everyone. "What happened?" Brand yelled. "We're being attacked," Jamie yelled back. "How do you know?" came Hildur, and Jamie didn't miss the insinuation in that question. Thankfully, he didn't get the chance to answer, because right then someone called his name. "This way!" It was Astrid's mom, Likely, having pushed her way through the crowd to get to them. "All of you," she said, "to the Great Hall." They had no reason to protest. About 10 more meters, and there was a chorus of panicked shouts somewhere behind them, but when Jamie tried to turn around to look, he saw nothing but fog. He stumbled, but Brand managed to steady him before he could fall. His green eyes were wide with fear. "What was that?" Jamie pressed his mouth shut. He didn't want to theorize. As they raced to the Great Hall, it didn't take long to realize that most of the villagers weren't running for safety. They were running for their weapons, and once they had them, they bolted back the way they'd come, or towards the harbor, or stood their ground, ready for anything. But mostly, they just looked lost, because the fog was nearly impossible to see through. It didn't seem to be acting like normal fog. It shifted around like oil in water, creating brief windows in the white before closing up again. Sometimes, Jamie couldn't even see 5 meters ahead. And not only did it impair their vision, every sound seemed to be muffled as well. Jamie could hear distant shouting, but it sounded impossibly far away, as if his ears were stuffed with cotton. The picture of what was truly going on within the fog was made a little clearer when a blood-curdling cry split the air. A white figure came into view, someone who was definitely not a Burkian, a sword raised over his head. Likely reacted so quickly, Jamie would have believed she had predicted the attack, even if it seemed the man had materialized out of the fog itself. Likely's battle axe intercepted the course of the sword before she smashed the hilt of her axe into the man's temple. He crumbled immediately. Jamie could only stare with his mouth open. "Nice hit," Hildur said. Her cool facade was broken by the tremor in her voice. The man was wearing some kind of armor, but Jamie couldn't figure out what it was made out of. It was white, covering most of his body. He was also wearing a helmet, though it obviously hadn't helped him much, as there now was a huge dent in it. The helmet covered his face entirely. "Come on," Likely said, waving at them to continue. Jamie started to reach out for the helmet. He wanted to see what was beneath it, because the fact that they were being attacked by real physical people didn't make sense. Did the Snow Queen favor another tribe or something? Did they know about her and obey her orders? If so, what did she have against Berg exactly? It just wasn't adding up. Brand grabbed his arm before he reached the unconscious warrior. "We're gonna lose him," he said, and tugged Jamie along. "Come on." They caught up with Likely and the others. The screams and shouts from around them became more frequent, along with the sound of metal against metal and other indiscernible noises that Jamie thought he was better off not knowing the source of. His breath steamed as he ran, and he realized just how cold it was getting. That, along with Jack's warning, made it clear that this was no ordinary attack. There was still no sign of Jack. Jamie wanted to turn back and find him, despite Jack's orders, but he doubted he'd get very far. He didn't have a weapon, and even if he did, he wasn't confident enough to think that an 11-year-old stood a chance against the Snow Queen's forces. "Where did they come from?" Anders gasped as they ran up the stairs. "They must have surrounded the island. It looks like they're coming from every direction." "We'll take care of them," Likely said confidently, smiling down at them, and Jamie had no difficulty seeing where Astrid's personality came from. She pushed the doors to the great hall open. "Just stay together in here until someone comes to—" "Wait." Her eyes flickered between them. "Where's Scotty?" Jamie's heart sank. He looked around. She'd been with them just moments ago. "We have to look for her," he said, taking a step back down the stairs. "No. Stay here, all of you," Likely ordered, and began ushering them inside. "I'll find her. Stay here." Then she slammed the door on them. The sound echoed through the vast hall before fading into heavy silence. Jamie turned around to look at his friends. They all looked scared and helpless, but when he met Hildur's gaze, her face hardened. "Something's not adding up," she declared. Jamie took a step back. "What, you think I had something to do with this?" he asked, even though he knew that was exactly what she was thinking. "I'm literally 11. How would I do that?" "I don't know. Sorcery, maybe?" "Oh, not you two." Hildur pointed a finger at him. "If you think people have just forgotten the way you and your big brother came here, you—" "Hildur, calm down," Brand cut in, stepping between them. Jamie was grateful. He'd been afraid Hildur would start throwing punches. It's not sorcery," Brand continued, but then glanced at Jamie as if to ask, "Right?" "It's just a surprise attack. They were probably just nearby and saw the fog and thought it was a brilliant chance to attack, because it would take away our advantage with the dragons and all." Jamie blinked. That did make a lot of sense. Yeah, he said, fighting the sinking feeling in his stomach. "That's probably it." "That doesn't explain why you and Jack already knew," Anders said. "Why you came flying in on Toothless. There was no way you could have seen them coming. So how did you know?" Jamie didn't have a good answer. Jack saw them coming." "He did not," Hildur bellowed. "Stop lying." "I'm not lying." "Well, you're definitely not telling the truth." Jamie swallowed back the lump forming in his throat. If me and Jack somehow had something to do with this," he said, lowering his voice in an attempt to seem calmer than he was, "why would we warn anyone about the attack?" Anders and Hildur shared a look but said nothing. Brand shifted uncomfortably, looking at Jamie like he had something he wanted to say, but he kept quiet. "Maybe you were having second thoughts," Hildur eventually said. "You tell me." "I have nothing to say," Jamie bit back. Like Brand said, they probably just saw the chance and took it." "None of these explains the weird fog," Brand muttered. Then he glanced at Jamie again with that same inquiring expression. "Not any normal explanation, anyway." Jamie felt his jaw go slack, but before he could respond, the entrance door opened. They all scrambled back, but just as quickly scrambled forward again when Shrug, Brenda, and Gustav came out of the fog, followed by, "Jack!" Jamie threw his arms around him. He heard Jack give a sigh of relief as he got down to his knees and hugged Jamie back. Then they just as quickly pulled away, checking each other for injuries. Jack seemed fine, save for the marks on his face, which now were so stark white they seemed almost blue. Behind him, Bran sobbed as he reunited with his siblings, and Jamie's chest twisted painfully. "We have to find Scotty," he said. "She was with us, but she disappeared. We were attacked and we couldn't see anything, and we have to find her." The little color left in Jack's face drained away. "You stay here," he said. "I'll find her." "No," Jamie protested, grabbing Jack's arms. "I want to come with you." Jack looked so awfully tired. He shook his head. "You can't," he said. "You have to stay here where it's safe. Block the doors and wait until—" "I'm not going to let you go and just wait and hope you don't get killed out there," Jamie yelled, his voice breaking. "If I stay, you stay too. But we can't stay because we have to find Scotty. And I hope she's not out already." The words died in his throat. "I'll find her faster on my own," Jack said. "She'll be fine. We'll all be—" "You're not a guardian anymore, Jack." Jamie regretted the words immediately. Jack's face went blank, like he was using all his willpower not to show how those words affected him. Jamie knew they did, but it was the truth, and that's why he kept going. "You have no powers, and you're still weak, and you can't fight with a sword, and I want to go with you, Jack." He realized belatedly that he'd started crying. Jack bowed his head for a moment before getting to his feet. "I know," he said, his face a stony mask. It looked uncharacteristic on him. "But you're staying here. I have to go now. Stay here." Jamie had never heard Jack sound so authoritative. It left him standing with his mouth hanging open as Jack turned and jogged back down the stairs, but not before shutting the door firmly in Jamie's face. Hiccup was torn between following Jack and making sure his dad was all right. But of course he was all right. He was Stoick the Vast, and he wouldn't possibly be brought down by a whack on the nose. Hiccup was just slightly worried by the fact that Stoick had stumbled back at all, and that Jack had managed to break free. Maybe Stoick had let him go on purpose? Judging by the fury in his expression, Hiccup doubted that was the case.
"What does he know?"
Stoick thundered as they hurried off the platform.
"And where's Skullcrusher?"
"I don't know,"
Hiccup said, jumping up onto Toothless's back as they ran.
"And I don't know. I'm going to find Astrid and the others and see if we can find the enemy ship. They must have— Oh, look out!"
Someone came barreling out of the fog towards them, his whole body covered in white armor, but before the someone even came close, Toothless blasted him, and he fell over the side of the stands and into the sea. Hiccup didn't get a chance to look properly at him. Stoick gave a furious growl.
"That boy," he rumbled. "There's something he's not telling us."
Hiccup swallowed.
"One problem at a time," he said weakly. "See you in a bit. Come on, Toothless."
It took about 10 seconds of flying before there was an almost collision. There was a familiar squawk of a deadly natter, and it almost drowned out in the indignant yell from its rider.
"Hiccup!"
Astrid yelled, coming up to fly beside them once Stormfly had found her balance.
"What's going on? How come we're being invaded but we can't find any enemy ships anywhere? They must have traveled in rowing boats or something."
The image was ridiculous, but at this point Hiccup was ready to accept anything.
"I don't know," he admitted. "Are you sure there's nothing? I mean, there has to be. They can't have come here on dragons, can they?"
His stomach was beginning to feel like a giant knot.
"Do you think it could be Krogan?"
Astrid shook her head.
"I've seen no other dragons either," she said, before wincing as a scream echoed up from the ground. "We have to get down there. There's no way we can fight from up here. Also, what do you mean you don't know? What was up with Jack?"
Hiccup rubbed his face, as if that would somehow clear his mind.
"I really don't know, Astrid," he said.
He had to focus to see her face through the fog, and she did not look happy.
"He told me something was coming, and then something came. I don't know how he knew."
Astrid's expression was hard as stone.
"Right, we'll deal with that later,"
she then decided, before swooping down towards the ground. Hiccup swallowed back the nausea growing in his stomach and followed her. The ground was about 5 meters below him when a sudden gust of icy wind blew them off course, and Toothless made a guttural sound. Hiccup tried shifting the gear, but it was jammed. No, it was frozen stuck. They hit the ground painfully, the momentum throwing Hiccup off. His head connected with the frosty ground, and the world went dark. Jack hadn't felt this bad since losing Easter, if not worse. He bolted back down the stairs, feeling like he was running straight into the abyss. This would have been so much easier if he could still fly. It would have been so much easier if he still had his powers. Jamie was right. Jack already knew that. But Jack was right too. He was faster on his own without having to look out for Jamie as well, and he had to find Scotty before something happened to her. Unless that something had already happened. He tried not to think about it. He got to the bottom of the stairs and managed to slip on the last step, sending him sprawling. It was the only thing that saved him from having his head take a permanent vacation from his body. He could feel a blade grazing his cheek as it passed over him. He yelped and rolled away. The attacker, a white-armored soldier with a helmet covering his face, stumbled slightly with the momentum, but was quick to steady himself. It barely gave Jack time to scramble to his feet and jump away. "Who are you?" he yelled at him. The soldier didn't answer. He struck again, but this time Jack dodged it easily and managed to land a hit on the soldier's side. It didn't do much to the soldier himself, but if Jack wasn't seeing things, it looked like the armor had cracked slightly. As the soldier stumbled back, his body twitched as if an electric jolt had gone through his body, before his thin limbs jerked back into motion. Jack jumped back as the soldier attacked again. "Do you fight for the Snow Queen?" he asked. "Is she here? How did—" He yelped as the blade came close to slitting his throat, arching his back awkwardly to avoid it. He flailed for a moment, but still avoided the next slash with ease. He was in control. He just needed to find out who these people were and how they were connected to the Snow Queen. Because he knew they were. He didn't know how he knew, but it was like the information had just been fed into his brain. He was about to go in for another whack to the ribs, but just then there was a shrill war cry coming from somewhere above. "Move aside, Jackson!" Snotlout bellowed, and Jack barely had time to jump to safety before a wave of fire washed over the soldier, engulfing him completely. "Snotlout, don't!" It was too late. Jack watched with horror as the soldier crumbled into a steaming heap. Then he forced himself to look away, instead focusing on Snotlout, who landed on Hookfang with a triumphant laugh. "Why did you do that?" Snotlout's smile wavered before completely disappearing. A scowl replaced it, and he jumped off his dragon. "I saved your life," he said. "I had it under control," Jack snapped, pushing himself to his feet. "I was trying to talk to him." "Talk to him?" Snotlout repeated, now stomping towards Jack. Jack couldn't help but notice the mace he was holding. "You know what? Astra told me you were the one to warn Hiccup about this attack, but as you can see," he gestured around them, "or not see, there's no way you could have seen them coming. So how—"
"I had nothing to do with this," Jack hissed. "I realize it might seem a bit—"
"A bit?"
"Whatever. We don't have time for this. Scotty's missing, and I have to find her before—" The fog shifted behind Snotlout, and Jack reacted the only way he could. He hurled his staff towards Snotlout, and the latter had only time to widen his eyes before the staff whisked past his face and collided with the man behind him. The man made a strangled sound beneath his helmet, staggering back. Snotlout jumped away, then backed up to Jack's side. "Now we're even," Jack informed him, before bolting to retrieve his staff. He snatched it from the ground, and then pointed it instinctively at the man, who quickly got back to his feet. "Who are you?" Jack tried again, but was starting to understand that these people weren't of the chatty type. The man lunged at him, and Jack dodged, rolling away and landing on his feet. "What are you doing?" Snotlout barked. "What does it look like? Getting yourself killed?" Jack gritted his teeth and dodged the soldier's next attack before hitting him upside the head. The helmet definitely cracked, but still held together. Jack was beginning to suspect what kind of material it was made out of. He was just thinking to himself how easy these guys were to bring down when another armored soldier came charging out of the fog. "Snotlout! 5 o'clock!" "What?" "Behind you!" Snotlout gave a yelp, but Jack didn't get to see the outcome of that encounter before his attention was forced back to the guy he was currently fighting. He dodged his next attack, then whacked him with his staff, once in the chest and then on the back of his head. The soldier grunted before staggering to the ground. He didn't get back up. Jack was about to hurry to Snotlout's aid, but then Hookfang, quite efficiently, flicked the soldier away with his tail. The soldier crashed against the stone banister before rolling face down into the stairs. Snotlout exhaled heavily. "Thanks, Fangster," he muttered, before turning to Jack. "Now." "Let me ride with you," Jack said. "We have to find Scotty." "What? No," Snotlout protested. "I don't know if I can trust you." Jack stared at him. He took a deep breath. "Snotlout," he said, forcing himself to sound calm. "A child is missing. You can find out whether or not I'm a traitor after we found her." Snotlout's expression suggested that Jack didn't look very calm at all, his mouth becoming a thin, nervous line.
Then he opened it as if to argue more, but never got so far before another volley of soldiers came running out of the fog, and in the next moment Jack and Snotlout were back to back. "Hook Fang!" Snotlout yelled, but Hook Fang was backing away as if something much bigger and much scarier than him was coming his way. Jack couldn't see what it was, but a sharp pain rippled up through the fern patterns on his cheek, along with a freezing gust of wind, making him cry out. Snotlout sent him a startled look. "Jack?" Jack turned to him, just in time to see a mace hurtling towards Snotlout's head. He didn't think. He lunged forward, pushing Snotlout out of the way, and a sharp pain in his shoulder followed. The world turned white, or whiter, for a moment, but he managed to swing blindly with his staff, and it connected with something that made a horrible crunching noise. The world came back into focus, and they didn't have the time to check for injuries. The fight was still on. And despite the pain and the danger right in front of his face, all Jack could think about was for each second they spent here, Scotty was somewhere, possibly by herself, possibly in danger, or possibly... He let out a guttural cry. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, he imagined he was back in Burgess, fighting pitch with the other Guardians. He'd done that, and he could do this, Guardian or not. And he did. It all seemed a bit blurry in retrospect, but after what might have been seconds, just as well as minutes, some of the soldiers lay unconscious on the ground, while others had disappeared back into the fog. Jack realized he was panting. "Great Odin's ghost, what was that?" Snotlout stammered, his voice cracking. His eyes were shifting between Jack and the bodies on the ground incredulously. Eventually, they settled on Jack. "You're bleeding," he said helpfully. Jack pressed a hand against the fern patterns. "Get Hook Fang under control," he said, "before they come back with reinforcements." Snotlout didn't argue this time. He jogged over to Hook Fang, who was cowering by the stairs. Snotlout seemed confused about this as he tried to calm him down, but Jack knew. There was something about the air. He wondered if Babytooth could sense that now as well, when it was even getting to the dragons. It took a couple more minutes, but Hook Fang eventually calmed down, and Snotlout helped Jack onto the saddle. He was looking at him with wariness and something that looked suspiciously like awe, and if Jack had been his normal self, he would have teased him about it. But right now, he held onto the saddle and tried not to wince as Hook Fang took to the air. They soared towards the village. At least Jack assumed that they were heading for the village, but all he saw was white, except for a single instance where he got a glimpse of the street below, where none other than Gothi was running alongside her Gronkle, her staff in one hand and a small battle-axe in the other. Jack shook his head, mentally scolding himself for thinking that Gothi would hide away in her hut. Old age or nothing on her. And then they saw nothing. Jack muttered some unpretty words, this time in English, but it seemed Snotlout got the gist anyway. "This fog. I've never seen anything like it," Snotlout said. "Well, maybe once or twice, but never at this time of year." "It only happens during devastating winter?" Jack guessed. Snotlout was quiet. "Yeah," he then said, his voice weak. "You know, the twins told me—" Jack never got to hear what the twins told him. There was a guttural roar, one which Jack immediately recognized as Toothless, and was coming from below them. "Toothless is in trouble," he said. "Dive!" Snotlout obeyed without question. It was a strange change of pace, but Jack couldn't complain. They soared through the fog and landed on the ground with enough force to make Jack groan in pain. Then the fog shifted, creating a window that framed Toothless, cornered by a horde of those white armored warriors. He whipped around, his pupils panicked slits, shooting plasma at the enemies, but for each one he took down, more just kept coming. Hiccup was nowhere in sight. Then the window in the fog shut again, as if it was intentionally taunting them. And another window opened, along with a thunderous roar that Jack also had no problem identifying. Stoick, fighting 3 soldiers at the same time, and somehow keeping his ground. Jack almost thought it would be safe to just leave him to it, but knew that the tide could change at any moment. He hopped off Hook Fang. "Help Toothless," he ordered, before bolting towards Stoick, and just in time as well. There was another gust of wintry air, and pain shot up the side of Jack's face. The fog swirled, and more enemies appeared out of it, threatening to overwhelm the chief. "Hey!" Jack bellowed, and picked up a fallen knife, a white one, icy to the touch, and threw it at one of the soldiers with immaculate accuracy. Still, the blade bounced off the armor, but at least it got their attention.
"Jackson!"
Stoick growled, as if he wanted to wring his neck, but Jack ignored that and ran to his aid.
"You're hurt,"
he then said, and Jack realized that the growl might have been concern. Who knew, really, with Stoick the Vast? Jack jumped into battle, doing his best at channeling his 300 years' worth of fighting, despite the ache in his shoulder.
"Where's Hiccup?"
he yelled back, ignoring the remark. "He's not with Ruthless." Stoick grunted as he brought a man down with his bare fists. Jack faltered for a second, stunned that someone could just do that, and that Jack had still managed to break free from him earlier, but was quickly forced to focus again. There was a thought in the back of his head, though, that he would pay a lot for the chance to see a fight between Stoick and North.
"Went off to check for ships,"
Stoick replied, and Jack noted the hint of worry in his voice.
"Haven't heard from him since."
Jack's chest flared with a sudden wave of horror. He tried his best to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. He ducked away from an incoming blade, then brought the attacker down by kicking his legs out under him. When he was down, he brought the bottom of his staff down onto his forehead like a spear. Again, he wondered who these guys were and why they were so easily defeated if they really were sent from the Snow Queen. Something about it felt horribly off.
"Have you seen Scotty?"
Jack asked.
"Scotty?"
Stoick's expression softened, concern mixing in with a wild look in his eyes.
"No. Why?"
"She's—" Jack faltered. Mentioning that the little girl had distracted them both, and for a split second Jack saw something glinting in the air behind Stoick, the blade hidden mostly in the fog. He was standing too far away to do anything about it. It was too late. He desperately reached out.
"Look out!"
In the following second, Jack was fully prepared to witness Stoick's head tumble off his shoulders and into the fog. But then came a miracle in the form of human error. The soldier stumbled, giving Stoick just enough time to swing around and bring his axe into the man's ribs. Jack could already tell he wouldn't be forgetting the sound it made any time soon. Stoick exhaled heavily, eyes darting around for any more enemies. It seemed they were safe for now. He looked at Jack and nodded once.
"You would have had me,"
he acknowledged. Jack swallowed. He didn't know what to answer, and Stoick's gaze was uncomfortably intense, so he turned away. And then the fog parted, just for a moment. Jack could see a figure lying on the ground a few meters away, slowly and painstakingly pushing himself up with his arms. Blood was running down the side of his face, and, right in his blind spot, a tall, skeletal soldier was sneaking up on him, a dagger raised over his head. Jack forgot all about Stoick. He set into a sprint.
"Hiccup!"
Hiccup's head felt like it had been split open. Probably because it had, he realized, once he lowered his hand from the side of his head to see his fingers bright red and glistening with blood. Not good, he decided groggily. Would have to deal with that sometime soon. It was so white around him. His brain was working at less than half the speed it usually did. Where was he? Had he fallen off Toothless again? Why was it so cold? Gods, was he dead?
"Hiccup!"
He looked up. Jack was running towards him, engulfed by fog. He didn't look too good. His hair was even more ruffled than usual, and there was a dark red stain on his cloak, blood running down his right arm and down to his fingers. That, and his eyes were practically creating sparks. That's how intense he looked. But why was he... Hiccup looked up. Oh, he thought. If he wasn't dead already, the knife glistening above him would soon take care of that. He lunged to the side and rolled away. The blade impaled itself into the earth instead, and then Jack barreled into the attacker, sending them both sprawling.
"Jack,"
Hiccup croaked.
"you're hurt." "I've noticed,"
Jack snapped, rolling away from the armored man, then just kicked him in the face. Hiccup already knew Jack was a skilled fighter, but all he'd ever seen of those skills was during friendly sparring sessions. This, he decided, was the final proof that one should definitely not get on his bad side. Astrid would be proud. And then he ran over to crouch beside Hiccup, and his whole demeanor changed in a flash. His hand came up to Hiccup's face, cupping his jaw gently. Either blood didn't bother him, or he just didn't care because he was covered in blood as well, and a little more couldn't do any harm.
"Are you okay?"
he asked. His breath steamed in the air. His face was pale, but his eyes were stormy. He almost looked like a different person. Hiccup found himself at a loss for words. He nodded weakly. Jack's mouth quirked up in a smile, and just like that, proved that he was the same old Jack, whoever that might be. Good. Stay that way.
"Hiccup!"
Stoick came running towards them, and suddenly Hiccup felt very embarrassed.
I'm fine,"
he said, staggering to his feet. He frowned, trying to remember what had happened.
The gears were frozen over," he said. "Toothless and I crash-landed, and then I guess I hit my head. How's the battle going?"
Jack looked around. Hard to say, he mumbled. I just don't understand where... He trailed off, his eyes coming to stop on a point behind Hiccup. Did you hear that? Hiccup turned around, but all he saw was fog. Hear what? And then he did hear. Jack! Hiccup hadn't even noticed Jack holding his hand before he let go of it. It's Scotty, he said. Then he ran off without another word. Hiccup wanted to run after him, but then gravity decided to do a sudden shift and he stumbled sideways. Stoick caught his arm, steadying him. He'll be fine, Stoick said, and there was something in his voice that Hiccup couldn't quite place. His dad had always been hard to read, and even harder to get through to sometimes. But if he wasn't completely mistaken, Stoick the Vast seemed a bit awestruck. Hiccup's head was still aching, and his skin felt disturbingly warm where the blood was trickling down. However, he was slowly registering that there was a tingling feeling where Jack's hand had been. Not unpleasant, but not exactly pleasant either. Strangely, it made him think about the time he was hit by lightning. Even against the wintry air around them, Hiccup mused, Jack's hand had been abnormally cold. Scotty! Jack yelled. Over here! Jack! I'm here! Didn't this situation feel awfully familiar? Jack! Something was wrong. Obviously, something was wrong, but something was off. The fog swirled around him, a little too literally. It was as if it was forming a circle, trapping Jack inside. The noise from the battle had faded away as well. Jack had no idea where on Berg he was or where he was heading, but he marched forward, following the sound of Scotty's voice. And then he saw her. Not Scotty, someone else. The Snow Queen looked the same as she had on Jotun Island. She was standing with her back to Jack, her moonlight hair tumbling down her fur cloak. Jack dug his heels into the ground, coming to a stop. He couldn't breathe. Was he too late? Where is she? He demanded. Snow tilted her head to the side, as if Jack was an annoying mosquito buzzing by her ear. Then she slowly turned around, stepping to the side, and Jack's heart plummeted to the very pit of his stomach. Jack! Jamie croaked. He was holding Scotty's hand, and Scotty was clinging to Jamie as if her life depended on it. They both looked terrified. I found her,